Hello, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to welcome you back to the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead. The year is 1951, the war is a fading memory, and nothing ever happens here, or so everyone likes to believe. My name is Jane Marple, though most folks simply call me Miss Marple, and I do enjoy a little puzzle now and then. You are about to hear the curious case of the Schoolmaster's fall. A tragedy that was almost, but not quite, an accident. Chapter 1. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The village of St. Mary Mead had changed very little since the day Queen Victoria died, and it intended to go on changing very little until the next coronation, thank you very much. The high street still curved gently past the Blue Boar, the haberdashers, and Miss Hartnell's aggressively respectable tea rooms. The War Memorial, erected in 1920 and already acquiring a comfortable mossy look, kept watch over the small green where the older men played bowls on summer evenings and the younger ones tried to look unimpressed by the older men. Roses climbed over cottage doors, the postman still rode a bicycle with a wicker basket, and the church clock, which had been 5.5 minutes fast since 1913, continued to be 5.5 minutes fast, with the serene confidence of one who knows nobody will ever dare correct him. It was Tuesday, the 16th of September, 1951, a day so golden and unhurried that it might have been pressed between the pages of a ladies' magazine and labeled, "Typical English Autumn Afternoon." The sky was the color of a freshly washed Wedgwood plate, and the air carried the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and late blackberries. At 20 minutes past 3, the schoolhouse clock, a gift from the County Education Committee in 1947 and still regarded with mild suspicion, struck the hour with the self-conscious precision of something that knows it replaced a much older, friendlier clock. Children spilled out of the red brick building in a clamor of satchels and scuffed knees. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, headmaster for the past 23 years, stood at the gate in his old tweed jacket and college tie, bidding each child good afternoon by name. He had a long, scholarly face, a neat gray mustache, and the mild, slightly distant manner of a man who had spent 4 decades trying to interest the young in the Export of Wool Act of 1660. Tommy Symington, aged 9 3/4, paused to ask whether the cricket ball that had sailed over the wall into Mrs. Price Ridley's garden might be retrieved before she noticed. "Tomorrow, Thomas," Mr. Hawthorne said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Mrs. Price Ridley is taking her Victoria sponge to the Women's Institute this afternoon, and one does not interrupt a lady when she is guarding a sponge. Off you go." He watched the boy scamper away, then turned to Pat Euclid, the school cat, who was winding himself round the railings with the sinuous persistence of a creature who knows supper is only an hour away. Finally, briefcase in one hand and a neat coil of new hemp rope over his shoulder. "For botanical specimens," he always explained. Mr. Hawthorne set off up the narrow footpath that climbed the hill behind the school toward the disused chalk quarry. Several people noticed him go. Miss Rampage, closing her sweet shop, saw him pass. Old Mr. Polk, the constable, leaning on his bicycle outside the police house, raised a lazy hand in greeting. Even Miss Marple, sitting at her garden gate with her knitting, caught a glimpse of the upright figure moving steadily between the hawthorn hedges. She noted the rope, as she had noted it twice a week for the past month, and wondered mildly why a man who collected neither plants nor fossils needed quite so much of it. The path was steep, little more than a sheep track worn into the chalk by generations of boys looking for birds' nests, and more recently, by Mr. Hawthorne himself. Brambles tugged at coat sleeves, loose flints rolled underfoot. Halfway up, the ground fell away sharply on the left into the old quarry, a great white bowl gouged out of the hillside, its floor now a tangle of elder and traveler's joy. A rusted iron ring, once used for hauling carts, was still bolted to the rock just above the final bend. At 25 minutes to 4, Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching the aforementioned Victoria sponge in a wicker basket, was hurrying along the lower lane toward the vicarage when she heard a sound. She described it afterwards as a sort of sharp yelp, more surprised than pained, if you know what I mean. She looked up, saw nothing, and hurried on. One does not arrive late for a Women's Institute meeting carrying a sponge that has taken 3 attempts and 2 pounds of best butter. 10 minutes later, young Fred Bell, delivering groceries on his bicycle, noticed a dark shape lying at the foot of the quarry path. He propped his bicycle against the gate, scrambled down, and discovered the body of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne. The headmaster's neck was unmistakably broken. His eyes stared up at the calm blue sky with the faint astonishment of a scholar who has just encountered an error in a familiar text. Fred ran for P.C. Polk, who arrived panting, helmet askew. The constable knelt, felt for a pulse he knew he would not find, and then looked about him with the air of a man who has never before had to deal with anything more serious than Mrs. Dane Calthrop's cat stuck up a walnut tree. The rope lay 20 feet above the body, neatly coiled and tied to the old iron ring with an elaborate knot. The briefcase stood upright beside the path, closed and latched, papers undisturbed. A single chalky handprint, Mr. Hawthorne's own, was smeared on the white rock just where the path narrowed dangerously. By 4 o'clock, the church bell had tolled once, the village signal for sudden death. Housewives paused. Over their ironing, men looked up from gardens, and children were called indoors earlier than usual. In the garden of her small Georgian house, Miss Jane Marple laid down her knitting and gazed thoughtfully toward the hill. "Dear me," she said softly to the robin who was digging for worms in her border. "How very curious." She had seen Mr. Hawthorne leave the school not 40 minutes earlier. She had noticed the rope, the briefcase, the brisk yet unhurried stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going. People who fall down quarry paths, Miss Marple reflected, usually drop whatever they are carrying. Briefcases fly open, papers scatter like white butterflies, ropes uncoil and follow their owner to the bottom. Yet here was the rope 20 feet above the body, tied with what even her inexperienced eye recognized as a most complicated knot, and the briefcase closed as neatly as though it had been set there by a careful housemaid. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her needles were still. "Accident?" she murmured. "Perhaps. But accidents, like people, usually behave in character, and this one does not." Above her, the quarry path lay quiet in the slanting September light, keeping its small, deadly secret to itself. Chapter 2. 5 People Who Quarreled with the Schoolmaster. The inquest was fixed for Friday, but by Wednesday morning, St. Mary Mead had already reached its verdict: tragic accident. The coroner would merely dot the I's. Everyone said the same thing with only the slightest variation in wording, as though reading from an invisible parish notice board. Poor Mr. Hawthorne. The path was always a death trap. 67 is no age to be clambering about quarries with rope. Mark my words, the council should have fenced it off years ago. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and said very little. She had risen early, put on her dove-gray cardigan and the small brown hat with the velvet pansy that made her look exactly like everyone's favorite aunt, and gone for a gentle constitutional. In St. Mary Mead, a gentle constitutional was not exercise. It was reconnaissance. She began, as was only polite, at the school. The building still smelled of chalk dust, disinfectant, and the ghost of yesterday's boiled cabbage. In the staff room, 5 people moved about like actors who had forgotten their next line. They were the 5 who, in Miss Marple's quiet phrase, had lately quarreled with the deceased. She had a tidy mind and liked things arranged in 5s when possible. First, there was Miss Evelyn Forrester, 28, auburn-haired and far too pretty to be wasted on the Export of Wool Act of 1660. She had arrived from a progressive training college in 1949 full of new ideas about project work and nature tables. Mr. Hawthorne had not approved. Last Thursday, half the village had heard him telling her that young women who read Freud instead of the Bible have no place shaping young minds. Evelyn had replied at considerable volume that old men who treated the classroom like a prison ship would do better to retire. She had been seen crying in the cloakroom afterwards. Next, Mr. Clarence Fowler, science master, 63, thin as a retort stand and twice as brittle. He had been passed over for the headship in 1938 and again in 1945, each time because Mr. Hawthorne quietly assured the governors that Clarence lacked moral tone. Clarence had never forgiven him. Only last month he had been overheard muttering that he would see Hawthorne in his grave before he let the new laboratory grant be spent on frivolous history outings. Third came Mrs. Gladys Lintock, the school secretary, a plump, flustered woman of 45, who wore flowered overalls and the expression of someone perpetually about to remember something vital she had forgotten. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Hawthorne had discovered that 47,86 was missing from the tuck shop account. Mrs. Lintock had repaid $30 from her post office savings and begged for time with the rest. Mr. Hawthorne had given her until the end of term. "After that, my dear Gladys," he had said kindly, "the governors must be told." The fourth person was not on the staff at all. Captain Robert Haydock, Dr. Haydock's nephew, was home on leave from Malaya, tall, sunburnt, decorated, and openly courting Evelyn Forrester. Mr. Hawthorne had taken the old-fashioned view that a master's fiancée should not be seen leaving the Blue Boar with a soldier at 11 o'clock at night. There had been a blazing row on the school steps only 10 days ago. Robert had been heard to say that if Hawthorne laid down the law once more, he would knock his blasted head off. Finally, though no one quite liked to mention it in adult company, there was Dennis Price, 14, freckled and expelled in June for introducing a smoke bomb of his own manufacture into morning prayers. Dennis had sworn to get even with old Hawthorne if it was the last thing I'd do. He had been seen loitering near the quarry gate on several afternoons, hands in pockets, whistling defiantly. Miss Marple paused outside the staff room window, ostensibly admiring the Michaelmas daisies. Inside, the five moved like pieces on a board waiting for someone to begin the game. Evelyn Forrester was arranging nature specimens with unnecessary violence, slamming sycamore leaves into a flower press as though they had personally offended her. Clarence Fowler stood at the blackboard, rubbing out yesterday's equations with quick, angry strokes, leaving faint white ghosts of formulae on the slate. Mrs. Lintock was hunting frantically for something in a desk drawer, papers flying like startled pigeons. Robert Haydock had not yet arrived, but his presence hung in the air like pipe smoke. Evelyn kept glancing toward the door. Miss Marple drifted onto the post office, where Miss Rampage was weighing sugar for Mrs. Dane Calthrop. "Terrible about Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Rampage said automatically. "Still no use crying over spilt milk, though mind you, there's some as won't be crying at all. Human nature is a very curious thing," Miss Marple observed, purchasing half an ounce of peppermint humbug she did not particularly want. "One never knows, does one?" Outside, she paused again. Across the road, Clarence Fowler had emerged and was locking the science cupboard with a small, vicious snap. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like a man who had just lost an argument with himself. She walked slowly home past the war memorial where old Colonel Bantry was telling young Fred Bell that in his day, quarry paths had been a sight steeper and nobody had thought to fall down them. Miss Marple smiled politely and continued on her way. 5 people, she reflected, each with excellent reason to wish Mr. Hawthorne at the bottom of a chalk pit. And yet only one could have been on that path on Tuesday afternoon. She reached her gate, lifted the latch, and paused. "Of course," she said to the empty air, There is always the question of who benefits. And who, dear me, benefits most of all? A small spider was spinning a web between the rosemary bushes. Miss Marple watched it for a long moment, then went indoors to put the kettle on. There was, she felt certain, a great deal more to be discovered before the inquest on Friday. And she intended to discover it. Chapter 3. Tea, Gossip, and a Curious Knot. Thursday afternoon in St. Mary Mead belonged by ancient and unbreakable tradition to tea. At 3:30 precisely, the vicarage drawing-room filled with the gentle clatter of Crown Derby cups and the rustle of best frocks. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, believed that strong tea and fruitcake were the sovereign cure for almost every ill, including bereavement, and she had insisted that the Women's Institute meeting proceed as usual. Poor Mr. Hawthorne would be the first to say life must go on, she declared, and nobody quite liked to contradict her. Miss Marple arrived at 25 past, carrying a small Madeira cake she had baked at 7 that morning. She was greeted with the subdued excitement reserved for someone who might just possibly know something interesting. "Jane, dear, sit by me," commanded Miss Hartnell, patting the chintz sofa as though reserving a front pew. "You have such a clear head for these things." Mrs. Price Ridley, still flushed with the triumph of having her Victoria sponge awarded second prize, beaten only by Miss Blacklock's lemon drizzle, leaned forward conspiringly. "I was saying only this morning if that quarry path had been properly fenced, none of this would have happened. Mark my words, the council will have to answer for it." "Yet Mr. Hawthorne walked that path twice a week for 20 years, Miss Marple murmured, accepting a cup from Mrs. Dane Calthrop. "He knew every loose stone, every bramble. One does not suddenly forget at 67. A small silence fell. Into it dropped the soft, unexpected voice of Evelyn Forrester. She had slipped in late, wearing a dark green coat that made her look paler than ever. "He was carrying that ridiculous rope again," she said. "Always the same piece of new hemp. Said it was for tying up botanical specimens. I told him last week it was asking for trouble lugging things up a cliff path at his age." Miss Hartnell gave a little snort. "Botanical specimens! The man hadn't pressed a flower since 1932. I know because I was on the flower show committee with him." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "And was the rope ever used, my dear?" she asked Evelyn without looking up. Evelyn hesitated. "Well, no, it was always returned to the cupboard clean and neatly coiled. I used to tease him about it." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward again, sponge crumbs trembling on her lower lip. "I heard a cry, you know. Just the one. More of a yelp than a scream. I looked up, but there was nothing to see. Then I had to hurry on or be late." Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap. "At what time exactly, Letitia?" 25 minutes to 4. I remember because the church clock had just struck the 3/4, and I thought, oh dear, I shall have to run. 25 minutes to 4. Miss Marple filed the time away as neatly as a librarian returning a book to its shelf. Tea concluded with the usual small bustle of departure. Miss Marple, pleading a slight headache, left a little early and took the lane that skirted the foot of the hill. The quarry gate stood open, a strip of police tape fluttered forlornly, already half torn away by boys looking for adventure. She slipped through. The path was exactly as she remembered it from childhood rambles, narrow, treacherous, dazzling white in the low afternoon sun. Halfway up, she paused to regain her breath and noticed something the constable had missed. A single strand of bright green wool, precisely the shade of Evelyn Forrester's coat, caught on a bramble just where the path narrowed before the final bend. Higher still, the rusted iron ring glinted. The rope had been removed for examination, but the knot that had held it remained in Miss Marple's memory. 2 loops, a twist, and a final tuck that turned the whole into something unexpectedly decorative. She had seen that knot before, though not for many years. Her nephew Raymond had been keen on the Sea Scouts in the 20s. The troop leader had insisted on absolute perfection in knot tying. A double carrick bend, he had called it. Practically unknown outside nautical circles or the more enthusiastic kind of boys' organization. Miss Marple stood a long time looking at the place where the rope had been tied. 20 feet above the spot where Mr. Hawthorne had fallen. A man who trips and falls does not, as a rule, climb several yards upward before dying, nor does he tie complicated knots with a broken neck. She made her way down again slowly, mind turning like a quiet wheel. At the bottom she met P.C. Polk, red-faced and official. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Shouldn't really be up here, you know. Scene of the accident." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I am beginning to wonder whether it was entirely an accident, Constable." Polk stared. "But the coroner—" "Coroners are excellent at establishing how a man dies, but not always why. Tell me, did anyone mention to you that the knot in that rope was a double carrick bend?" "A double what, miss?" "Exactly," said Miss Marple and smiled. She continued homeward past cottages already drawing their curtains against the dusk. In the distance the school clock struck 5, a fraction too sharply as though anxious to be noticed. Cherry met her at the door with the news that Inspector Craddock had telephoned from Much Benham and would call tomorrow. "Very well, Cherry. And would you be so kind as to look out my old copy of Knots for Scouts? It is on the top shelf in the spare room behind the bound volumes of the Girl's Own Annual." Cherry blinked. "Knots, miss?" "Yes, my dear, one particular knot. I have a feeling it may prove most illuminating." Miss Marple removed her hat, smoothed her white hair, and sat down beside the fire. Outside, the first owl called from the vicarage elms. Somewhere in the village, 5 people were trying very hard to behave as though nothing had changed. But something had changed, irrevocably. A man was dead, and the knot that held the rope to the iron ring had been tied by a living hand. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and began very peacefully to wait. Chapter 4. The matter of the missing chalk dust. Friday morning broke soft and misty, the kind of weather that makes St. Mary Mead look as though it has been left under a damp muslin cloth overnight. Miss Marple rose early, ate 1 thin slice of brown toast with Cooper's Oxford marmalade, and set out before the village was properly awake. She had an appointment with chalk dust. Her first call was upon Clarence Fowler. Mr. Fowler lived in a small red-brick cottage at the far end of the lane that led to the cricket ground. Rambling roses, now heavy with scarlet hips, smothered the porch, and a brass telescope on a tripod stood in the window like a sentinel. The science master opened the door himself, polishing his spectacles on a large red handkerchief. He looked as though he had slept badly. "Miss Marple, this is an unexpected, pleasure. I do hope I am not disturbing you, Mr. Fowler. I was passing and thought of the poor children. They will be so unsettled. I wondered whether you, as the senior master now, might spare me a moment." Fowler hesitated, then stood aside. The sitting room smelled of pipe tobacco and chemicals. On the table lay an open box of rock samples, each neatly labeled in copperplate handwriting. Miss Marple's eye traveled at once to the cuffs of Fowler's old tweed jacket, draped across a chair back. They were edged, quite unmistakably, with a fine white powder. Chalk dust. She accepted a seat and folded her hands in her lap. "I understand you and Mr. Hawthorne did not always see eye to eye," she began gently. Fowler gave a short, bitter laugh. "That is putting it mildly. The man was a fossil, refused to spend a penny on proper equipment. Do you know he vetoed the purchase of a Bunsen burner because he said the old spirit lamps were good enough for Faraday? Faraday. I told him last week that if he blocked the new laboratory grant again, I would take the matter to the governors myself. And did you? I intended to. On Tuesday afternoon, in fact. But when I reached the quarry path, he was already... Fowler's voice cracked. Already gone. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. You walked up there on Tuesday? No, that is... I started to, but I thought better of it. Turn back at the gate. Ask anyone. Miss Marple made a small murmuring sound that might have meant anything. Her gaze drifted again to the chalk-dusted cuffs. Such a pity, she said, that the quarry is so very white. One brushes against the rock and the dust clings for days. Fowler flushed. I have not been near the quarry since Friday last. We collected moss specimens together then. That must be it. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, rising. Friday. How silly of me. She left him standing among his rocks, looking suddenly older than his 63 years. Her next visit was to the school itself. The building felt hollow without Mr. Hawthorne's measured tread in the corridor. Mrs. Lintock was in the office, surrounded by piles of exercise books and weeping into a scrap of handkerchief. Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful? And me with all these registers to finish before the inspector comes. Miss Marple patted her shoulder. You must not upset yourself, Gladys dear. Mr. Hawthorne would have wanted everything in order. Mrs. Lintock gave a gulping sob. He was going to sack me, you know. The money. I only borrowed it, my Bert's operation. I was paying it back 6 shillings a week. He found out last month. Said if the full amount wasn't in the account by the end of term, he would have to tell the governors. Now he's dead and I feel dreadful. Miss Marple made soothing noises and glanced around the room. On the shelf above the desk stood the coil of rope, the twin, or perhaps the very brother of the one found at the quarry. It was new, clean, and tied at each end with a simple overhand knot. Nothing like the elaborate double carrick bend. She left Mrs. Lintock to her tears and walked slowly homeward, pausing at the post office to buy stamps she did not need. Miss Rampage was full of news. They say Clarence Fowler's in a proper state, hasn't touched his breakfast, and young Dennis Price was seen hanging about the quarry yesterday, bold as brass. Dennis has an alibi, I believe, Miss Marple said mildly. So he says, pictures in much Benham. Though between you and me, that boy could talk himself out of Borstal and into the palace. Miss Marple smiled and continued on her way. At home, she found Cherry laying the table for lunch. Inspector Craddock telephoned again, miss. Says he'll be here at 3. Excellent. And did you find the book I asked for? Cherry produced Knots for Scouts, 1937 edition, with an air of triumph. Miss Marple turned at once to page 42. There, in a line drawing, was the identical knot, double carrick bend. Useful for joining 2 ropes when a neat appearance is desired. Much favored by sea scouts. She closed the book thoughtfully. After a light lunch of scrambled egg and cress, she put on her stout walking shoes and set out once more for the quarry. The mist had lifted. The chalk face gleamed like bone. She climbed slowly, resting every few yards until she reached the iron ring. There she stood for a long time, one gloved hand resting on the rock. The chalk was soft, almost talcum fine. A man who climbed up here to tie a rope would brush against it repeatedly. His cuffs, his knees, perhaps even his elbows would be white with it. Clarence Fowler claimed he had not been near the quarry since Friday. Yet the dust on his cuffs was fresh, unmarked by rain or dew. Miss Marple looked down at the spot where Mr. Hawthorne had lain, 20 feet below the ring, a distance exactly right for a man to fall if his ankles were suddenly snatched from under him by a rope flicked across the path. She nodded once as though confirming an appointment and began the careful descent. Behind her, the quarry settled back into silence, bright and pitiless and waiting. When she reached home, Inspector Craddock's car was already at the gate. He unfolded his long length from the driving seat and greeted her with the mixture of affection and exasperation she found rather endearing. "Aunt Jane, I hear you've been meddling again." "Not meddling, Dermot dear, merely observing. Come inside. I have something rather interesting to show you about chalk dust, and a knot that should have been forgotten 50 years ago." Chapter 5. A Smoke Bomb and an Alibi. Saturday belonged to the young. By 9:30, the high street rang with the squeak of bicycle bells and the shouts of boys released from a week of captivity. Among them, bright as a robin in his red school cap, darted Dennis Price, 14, freckled, and already the undisputed leader of every mischief within a 5-mile radius. Miss Marple, returning from the butcher with a modest portion of scrag end for Monday's stew, intercepted him neatly outside the post office. "Good morning, Dennis. Selling raffle tickets again?" Dennis grinned, unabashed. "Scout's jumble sale, miss. First prize a live duck. 10 chances a shilling." Miss Marple purchased 3 tickets she had no intention of winning. "I hear you were expelled last term," she said conversationally. Dennis's grin widened. "Old Hawthorne said I'd end in Borstal. Looks like he won't be there to see it, does it?" A less charitable soul might have called the remark heartless. Miss Marple merely noted the exact degree of bravado in the boy's voice. "And where were you on Tuesday afternoon, Dennis?" "In the pictures at Much Benham. The Lavender Hill mob. Alec Guinness is smashing. Went in at 2, came out 20 to 6. Ask Mr. Fairchild. He tears the tickets." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe I will." Much Benham was 7 miles away, served by a bus that left St. Mary Mead at 5 minutes to 2 and returned at 10 minutes past 6. The timing was tight but not impossible. Still, she felt in her bones that Dennis was telling the truth. Boys who plan murder do not usually boast about it afterwards with quite such transparent glee. She continued her errands, pausing at the cinema in Much Benham an hour later. Mr. Fairchild, resplendent in braided uniform, 2 sizes too large, confirmed everything. Little devil sat in the front row, ate 2 Wall's ices and a bag of bullseyes, laughed fit to bust when Guinness fell in the river. I had to shush him twice. Left when the big picture ended, 20 to 6 on the dot. The bus timetable corroborated the rest. Dennis had been 7 miles away when Mr. Hawthorne took his last walk. One could not be in 2 places at once, even at 14. One suspect eliminated. By lunchtime, the village was buzzing with a new rumor. Clarence Fowler had been seen burning papers in his back garden at dawn. Mrs. Butcher, whose cottage overlooked his, swore she had seen great clouds of smoke and him poking at it with a rake like a man possessed. Miss Marple filed this away and accepted an invitation to take a cup of coffee with Dr. Haydock's sister-in-law, who was staying at the doctor's house while Captain Robert Haydock was home on leave. The drawing room smelled of lavender polish and the particular tension that hangs about a house where a romance is being disapproved of. Robert Haydock stood by the window, tall, sun-browned, and clearly wishing himself back in Malaya. "I hear you are asking questions, Miss Marple," he began without preamble. "I'd be grateful if you left Evelyn out of it." "My dear boy, nobody has accused Miss Forrester of anything." "Not yet. But tongues wag. Hawthorne forbade me the school, said I was a bad influence. We had words, loud ones, on the steps last week. Half the village heard me tell him I'd like to break his neck. Well, someone has. And I don't want Evelyn dragged through the mud because of me." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "And where were you on Tuesday afternoon, Captain Haydock?" "In London. Caught the 11:47 from Much Benham, had lunch at my club, saw a show at the Haymarket, The Reluctant, debutante if you want the title, and came back on the 5:12. Here are the stubs." He tossed 2 pieces of pink cardboard onto the table, a return railway ticket, and a crumpled theater program. The dates were correct, the perforations genuine. Another alibi, solid as the Rock of Gibraltar. Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave. On the way home, she paused at the quarry gate. A small knot of boys had gathered, daring each other to climb to the iron ring. Dennis Price was not among them. She watched them for a moment, then continued to her cottage, where Cherry met her with the exciting news that Mrs. Lintock had been taken poorly and the doctor called. "Fainted clean away in the post office queue," Cherry reported. "Kept saying it was the shock." Miss Marple removed her gloves thoughtfully. 3 suspects now possessed alibis that would satisfy even Scotland Yard. Dennis Price at the cinema, Captain Haydock in London, and, if 20 members of the Women's Institute could be believed, Mrs. Lintock arranging the flower rota at the vicarage from 2 until 5:30. Only 2 remained without satisfactory explanation of their movements, Clarence Fowler and Evelyn Forrester. At 4 o'clock, Inspector Craddock arrived, filling the small sitting room with the scent of Harris tweed and London cigarettes. "Well, Aunt Jane, what have you got for me?" Miss Marple poured tea with the serene movements of a priestess at an altar. 3 excellent alibis, 1 coil of identical rope, a quantity of fresh chalk dust on a jacket whose owner swears he has not left the village, and a double carrack bend tied by someone who was once a Sea Scout leader. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You have been busy." "Merely observant, dear. Tell me, Dermot, when you were a boy, did you ever learn to tie a double carrack bend?" "Lord, yes. Uncle Edward drummed it into us. Said it was the only knot fit for a gentleman. Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple, handing him her cup, "I rather think we are dealing with a gentleman who has remembered his boyhood a little too well." Outside, the September dusk began to gather. Somewhere a boy whistled, a dog barked, and the village settled into its familiar evening hush. But in the small sitting room, the wheels were turning faster now, and the net, quiet, inexorable, and very nearly invisible, was beginning to close. Chapter 6. The captain's secret Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead was a hushed affair. The church bell called the faithful to matins, rooks clattered overhead, and the scent of damp leaves drifted through open vestry windows. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew near the south door, hymn book unopened in her lap, eyes resting on the 5 people who now occupied an entire row of their own. Evelyn Forrester looked pale but composed in navy blue. Captain Haydock beside her stared straight ahead as though on parade. Mrs. Lintock dabbed at her eyes with a black-edged handkerchief. Clarence Fowler had not come at all. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the porch, exchanging polite nothings about the dahlias and the shocking price of coal. When the little crowd thinned, she found herself beside Evelyn. "My dear, you look quite worn out. Will you take a cup of coffee with me? Cherry has made some of her cheese scones." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded gratefully. They walked in silence to the cottage. Cherry, well-trained, produced coffee and disappeared. Evelyn wrapped both hands round the cup as though they were cold. "I feel as though the whole village is watching me," she said at last. "Because of the quarrel, and because Robert and I, well, we wanted to be married at Christmas, and Mr. Hawthorne said it was impossible while I was on the staff. He was going to block my appointment as deputy head. Said a married woman had no place in a classroom." Miss Marple made a small, sympathetic sound. "And were you on the quarry path on Tuesday afternoon?" "No! I was marking essays in the staff room until 4, then I walked straight home along the lower lane. Mrs. Polk saw me. She was taking her husband's dinner to the police house. Ask her." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I already have. She confirms it." Evelyn's eyes filled. "Then why do people look at me so?" "Because, my dear, people are very foolish, and because Captain Haydock threatened Mr. Hawthorne in front of half the village. Evelyn gave a watery smile. Robert says things he doesn't mean when he's angry. He was in London all day Tuesday. He showed you the theater stub? He did. Though I confess I wondered why a man on leave from Malaya would choose a matinee of the reluctant debutante. Evelyn flushed. He didn't. He went to the matinee because the evening performance was sold out and he particularly wanted to see it before he sailed again next month. He has something to ask me, you see, and he thought the play might put me in the right mood. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A proposal? How very romantic. Evelyn laughed in spite of herself. He says if I refuse him, he will re-enlist for another 5 years in the jungle. So you see, Miss Marple, he really could not have been tripping headmasters down quarries. No, Miss Marple agreed. Captain Haydock is cleared. And so I think is Mrs. Lintock. 20 ladies saw her at the vicarage until 5:30, and Dr. Haydock himself collected her at 6 because she was so distressed. Evelyn set down her cup. Then only Mr. Fowler is left. Only Mr. Fowler, Miss Marple repeated softly. After Evelyn left, Miss Marple sat a long time by the fire. Cherry came in to lay the table for lunch and found her motionless. Penny for them, miss? I was thinking, Cherry, how very convenient alibis can be, and how very inconvenient the truth sometimes is. At 3 o'clock, Inspector Craddock returned, bringing with him the rope from the quarry and a large-scale ordnance survey map. I've been over the ground again, he said, spreading the map on the table. Whoever tied that rope to the iron ring must have climbed above the body after the fall. There are fresh scrapes on the chalk, knee marks, I'd say. And a clear print of a rubber-soled shoe, size 9, right beside the ring. Mr. Fowler wears size 9, Miss Marple murmured. He bought a new pair at Clark's in Much Benham only last month. I noticed because the assistant wrapped them in pink paper and Mr. Fowler hates pink. Craddock grinned. You notice everything. Not everything, dear. Only what matters. She took the rope and turned it in her hands. This hemp is new, bought from Badcock's ironmonger less than a month ago. Mr. Badcock remembers selling 3 fathoms to the school for botanical work. There is another length exactly like it in the cupboard, yet the piece at the quarry has been cut, not broken. Someone used a sharp knife. Craddock nodded. And the knot? Still the double carrick bend. I telephoned the Sea Scout archives yesterday. Pure curiosity, you understand. Clarence Fowler was a Keeler of the 1st St. Mary Mead Troop from 1919 to 1934. He won the Silver Acorn for knotting in 1928. Craddock whistled. That's pretty damning. It is suggestive, Miss Marple corrected gently. But not yet proof. Mr. Fowler says he turned back at the quarry gate on Tuesday. Yet his cuffs are white with fresh chalk dust, and he has been burning papers at dawn. Guilty men often burn things, Dermot. Or innocent men who are frightened. Exactly. Which is he? Craddock folded the map. I think it's time I had a word with Mr. Fowler. Miss Marple laid a hand on his sleeve. Not yet. Let him feel safe one more day. A cornered animal is dangerous, but one that believes the hunt has passed by will grow careless. Tomorrow is Monday. The school reopens. Children notice everything. Let us see what tomorrow brings. Craddock looked doubtful, but he knew his honorary aunt too well to argue. Very well. But if he bolts, he will not bolt. Where could he go? This is his village, his life. No, he will stay, and he will make one more mistake. They always do. Outside, the church clock struck 4. The sound drifted across the quiet gardens like a warning. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern was a complicated one, cables and diamonds, and required concentration. Rather like murder, she reflected. One small slip in the pattern, and the whole thing unravels. Chapter 7. The secretary's tears. Monday dawned bright and merciless. The children returned to school in a clamor of new shoes and old grievances, but the building felt wrong without Mr. Hawthorne's measured tread in the corridor. Miss Forrester rang the handbell with unnecessary vigor. Mr. Fowler kept to the science laboratory and locked the door. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Gladys Lintock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage in a state of complete collapse. Cherry admitted her with the air of one opening the door to a summer storm. "She's in the sitting room, miss, crying fit to drown the cat." Mrs. Lintock was indeed drowning. She sat on the edge of the chintz sofa clutching a sodden handkerchief, her flowered overall creased and her face blotched with tears. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can't bear it. They're all looking at me as though I pushed him. I know I took the money, £47 8 and 6pence, but I was putting it back 6 shillings every week, and Bert's operation cost so much, and now Mr. Hawthorne's dead and I feel as if I killed him." Miss Marple waited until the flood subsided a little, then pressed a cup of strong tea into the trembling hands. "Drink this, Gladys dear. Slowly. Now tell me exactly what happened on Tuesday afternoon." Mrs. Lintock gulped. "I was at the vicarage from 2 o'clock until 5:30. Flower rota for the Harvest Festival. 20 ladies saw me. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Price Ridley, all of them. Dr. Haydock fetched me at 6 because I was that upset when we heard. I never went near the quarry, I swear on my mother's grave." Miss Marple patted her knee. "Nobody is suggesting you did, my dear, but guilt is a heavy burden even when one is innocent of the greater sin." Mrs. Lintock dabbed her eyes. "I keep dreaming he's standing over me with the account book saying, 'Gladys, the governors must be told.' And then I wake up and he's dead, and I think perhaps God punished him for being hard on me." "God," said Miss Marple firmly, "does not usually employ quarry paths. Come now, dry your eyes. You have repaid £30 already?" £32 10 shillings, with another 5 put by for this Friday. "Then when the auditors come you will be ready, and no one need ever know." Mrs. Lintock stared. "You'd keep it quiet?" "I see no reason to ruin a respectable woman for an act of desperation that is being made good. Mr. Hawthorne is beyond earthly judgment now." The secretary's tears flowed afresh, but this time with relief. When she left half an hour later, she was almost steady on her feet, and she pressed Miss Marple's hand with fervent gratitude. 4 alibis now stood like solid gateposts: Dennis Price, Captain Haydock, Mrs. Lintock, and, though no one had yet asked her formally, Evelyn Forrester, seen by reliable Mrs. Pauk on the lower lane at 4:10. Only Clarence Fowler remained unaccounted for. At 2 o'clock, Inspector Craddock arrived, quietly triumphant. "I've had a man watching Fowler's cottage since dawn. At 12:30 he came out carrying a suitcase and walked to the station. Bought a single to London." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did he indeed? But the train doesn't leave until 3:10. My sergeant is on the platform. Shall we pull him in?" Miss Marple considered. "No, Dermot. Let him go as far as the barrier, then bring him here. I think a familiar surrounding may loosen his tongue more kindly than a police station." Craddock raised an eyebrow but obeyed. At 3:25, Cherry showed Clarence Fowler into the sitting room. He looked shrunken inside his old tweed coat, the chalk dust still faint on the cuffs, his eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple, Inspector, I was going to visit my sister in Putney. Nothing more." "With 1 suitcase and no return ticket?" Craddock asked mildly. Fowler sank into a chair as though his knees had given way. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mr. Fowler, why not tell us the truth? It will be easier for everyone." He was silent so long she thought he would not speak at all. Then the words came in a rush. "I quarreled with him again on Friday. He told me he was retiring at Christmas and had recommended Evelyn Forrester as his successor. A girl of 28. I have given 35 years to that school, and he passed me over for the third time. On Tuesday, I followed him up the path to beg, to demand another chance. He laughed at me, said I was a bitter old man who frightened the children. I lost my temper. He buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple's voice was soft as thistledown. And the rope? I always carried a length when we collected specimens. I flicked it out in anger, meaning only to trip him, to frighten him as he had frightened me for years. He stumbled, clutched at the rock, and went over before I could catch him. I stood there, stupid with shock. Then I thought, if I tied the rope higher, made it look as though he had fallen while securing it, no one would ever know. The double carrick bend? Craddock asked. Fowler gave a hollow laugh. Old habits? I taught generations of boys that knot. Pride, I suppose. Even then I wanted it neat. Miss Marple looked at him with great compassion. You burned your papers this morning. Old lesson notes, photographs of the scout troop, anything that reminded me of what I might have been. Craddock stood. Clarence Fowler, I must ask you to accompany me. Fowler rose without resistance. At the door he turned. I am sorry, Miss Marple, sorrier than I can say. When they had gone, the little room seemed very quiet. Cherry came in to clear the tea things and found her mistress gazing into the fire. Will he hang, miss? No, dear. Manslaughter, perhaps. The jury will understand a lifetime of disappointment. Juries usually do. Cherry hesitated. You don't seem very pleased. Miss Marple sighed. Pride is such a cold companion, Cherry. It keeps a man warm for years, and then one day it kills him, and someone else with him. She picked up her knitting again. Outside, the church clock struck 4, and St. Mary Mead settled back into its familiar drowsiness, as though nothing more disturbing than a lost cricket ball had ever happened within its borders. Chapter 8. The Knot That Should Not Have Been Tuesday Again. Exactly 1 week since Mr. Hawthorne had walked up the quarry path for the last time. The village had already begun to speak of him in the past tense, with the peculiar mixture of regret and relief that follows any sudden death. Miss Marple, however, was not quite ready to close the book. She had asked Inspector Craddock to bring Clarence Fowler to her cottage one final time before he was taken to Much Benham to make his formal statement. Craddock had raised both eyebrows but agreed. If it will give you peace of mind, Aunt Jane. At 2:30, the police car drew up. Fowler climbed out slowly, handcuffs glinting beneath his overcoat. He looked 10 years older than the man who had opened his door to Miss Marple only 6 days earlier. Cherry showed them into the sitting room and closed the door with the soft solemnity reserved for funerals and christenings. Fowler stood awkwardly until Miss Marple indicated the chair opposite her own. Sit down, Mr. Fowler, we have a little time. He obeyed. Craddock took up a position by the window, notebook in hand. Miss Marple regarded the prisoner with the same gentle detachment she might give to a difficult stitch. You told us yesterday that you flicked the rope in anger, meaning only to trip him. Yet the rope was found 20 feet above the body, tied with a double carrick bend. That is a considerable climb for a man in shock. Fowler's mouth worked. I don't remember clearly. Panic does strange things. Indeed it does, Miss Marple agreed. But it does not usually tie perfect Sea Scout knots, nor does it leave the briefcase closed and latched. A man who falls headlong drops whatever he is carrying. Fowler stared at his manacled hands. Craddock stirred. We have your confession, Mr. Fowler. There is no need to distress yourself further. Miss Marple raised a small hand. One moment, Dermot. There is something here that still troubles me. She opened a drawer and took out the length of rope that had been returned from the police laboratory that morning. It lay across her lap like a pale snake. This is the twin of the rope you used, is it not? Bought from Badcock's at the same time. Notice the manufacturer's mark, 3 red threads in the lay. Identical. Fowler nodded miserably. Now, Miss Marple continued, when P.C. Pauk arrived, the rope was tied to the iron ring with a double carrack bend. You were a Kayla for 15 years. You taught that knot to dozens of boys, but tell me, Mr. Fowler, did you ever teach it to a girl? Fowler looked up, puzzled. Girls weren't in scouts then. Exactly. And yet the knot in the quarry rope was tied left-handed. Craddock frowned. Left-handed? Yes. The final tuck goes under the standing part from the left. A right-handed person ties it the other way. I checked my nephew's old handbook. There is even a diagram. Fowler opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You are right-handed, Mr. Fowler. I have watched you chalk a blackboard for years. You hold the chalk in your right hand, the duster in your left. A long silence stretched across the room. Craddock moved forward. Aunt Jane, are you saying— I am saying, Miss Marple replied, that Mr. Fowler is shielding someone. Someone who climbed up to that iron ring after the fall and tied the rope left-handed, believing it would be taken for Mr. Fowler's knot. Fowler's head jerked up. No, Miss Marple looked at him with great compassion. You followed Mr. Hawthorne to plead for the headship. You quarreled. In anger, you did flick the rope, perhaps only to trip him, perhaps harder. He fell. You were stunned. Then another person came along the path, someone who saw an opportunity to be rid of Mr. Hawthorne forever and to let suspicion fall on you. That person tied the rope higher up, left-handed, and walked away. Fowler's face crumpled. She didn't mean murder, only to frighten him, like I did. When she saw what had happened, she panicked. She thought if the rope was tied with my old knot, no one would ever look further. She? Craddock asked sharply. Fowler buried his face in his hands. Evelyn Forrester. She is left-handed. She writes on the board with her left hand. She came to me yesterday evening crying, begging me to take the blame. Said she would lose everything, her post, Robert, her reputation. I have nothing left to lose. So I agreed. Miss Marple sighed very softly. Pride again. One person's pride destroyed Mr. Hawthorne. Another person's pride very nearly destroyed you. Craddock was already reaching for his notebook. I'll need to bring Miss Forrester in. Fowler lifted his head. Let me speak to her first. Please. She is only 28. She has her whole life. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. He nodded once. 5 minutes, he said. In the garden. But the sergeant will be watching. They watched from the window as Fowler walked slowly down the path and out of the gate. 10 minutes later, Evelyn Forrester arrived, white-faced, coat unbuttoned despite the chill. She and Fowler spoke beneath the apple tree. No sound reached the house, but Evelyn's shoulders began to shake. Finally, she nodded once, and Fowler placed a hand on her arm, awkward, paternal, before turning back toward the cottage. When he re-entered the room, his face was calm. She will come with you willingly. It was an accident, truly. She flicked the rope in a moment of fury. She never meant him to die. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Mr. Fowler. You have done a brave thing. He gave a wintry smile. Too late for bravery, but perhaps not too late for decency. Craddock let him out. Evelyn followed a few minutes later, dry-eyed now, walking between 2 constables as though in a dream. When the cars had gone, the garden seemed very quiet. Miss Marple stood at the window watching the last leaves drift from the apple tree. Cherry came in with fresh tea. So it was the pretty teacher after all. Miss Marple turned. It was anger, Cherry, and fear, and a moment when everything went wrong. That is all murder ever is. She sat down, picked up her knitting, and began to count stitches with the same tranquil concentration she brought to every puzzle. Human or woolen? Outside, the church clock struck 4. Another Tuesday in St. Mary Mead was drawing peacefully to its close. Chapter 9. The drawing room at the vicarage. The vicarage drawing room had been pressed into service for what Mrs. Dane Calthrop briskly called clearing the air. The chintz covers looked brighter than usual. The fire crackled with unnecessary cheer, and a plate of Miss Hartnell's rock cakes sat like small, disapproving sentinels on the side table. Everyone was there. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantelpiece, correct and expressionless. Miss Marple sat in the corner armchair, upright, gloved hands folded over her handbag, the very picture of a harmless old lady who had dropped in for a cup of tea. Evelyn Forrester, pale but steady, occupied the sofa between Captain Robert Haydock and a silent, stricken Clarence Fowler. Mrs. Lintock had been invited but sent word that she was too poorly, which everyone understood perfectly. The vicar had been gently but firmly excluded on the pretext of an urgent baptism. Craddock cleared his throat. Miss Forrester has made a full statement. For the record, I will repeat the salient points. Those who wish may leave now. No one need stay who finds this painful. No one moved. Craddock began. On Tuesday, 16th of September, Miss Evelyn Forrester followed Mr. Reginald Hawthorne up the quarry path at approximately 25 minutes to 4. She wished to plead with him, again, about her future at the school, and about her engagement to Captain Haydock. Mr. Hawthorne was adamant. Either she ended the engagement or she resigned at Christmas. Voices were raised. In a moment of blind anger, Miss Forrester flicked the length of rope she was carrying, identical to the one Mr. Hawthorne himself carried, across his ankles. He stumbled, lost his footing on the loose chalk, and fell to his death. Evelyn's voice was low but clear. I never meant him to die, I only wanted him to listen. When he went over the edge, I screamed, then I panicked. I thought if I could make it look as though he had fallen while tying his own rope higher up, no one would ever know it was me. I climbed to the iron ring and tied the rope with the only fancy knot I knew, the one Mr. Fowler had taught the staff for a country dancing display years ago. I am left-handed. I didn't realize the knot would betray me. She looked at Clarence Fowler. When Mr. Fowler confessed yesterday, I went to him and begged him to keep silent. He agreed because he is the kindest man I know. Fowler made a small, despairing gesture. Craddock continued. Mr. Fowler's original confession was therefore false in one particular. He was not present at the fatal moment. He did, however, encounter Miss Forrester coming down the path in great distress. She told him what had happened. Together they decided to let the rope remain as a blind. Captain Haydock spoke for the first time, voice rough. I knew nothing until last night. Evelyn telephoned me at the club in London after she left here. I came down on the first train this morning. Miss Marple's quiet voice floated across the room. There were so many little things. The closed briefcase. Mr. Hawthorne would have dropped it if he had simply tripped. The rope tied 20 feet above the body, the left-handed knot, the strand of green wool on the bramble. Exactly the shade of your coat, my dear. And of course the chalk dust on Mr. Fowler's cuffs. He had gone part way up the path on Friday with Mr. Hawthorne and brushed against the rock then, not on Tuesday. He burned his old papers because he believed he was sacrificing himself for you. Evelyn's eyes filled. I let him. I am more ashamed of that than of the anger that killed Mr. Hawthorne. Craddock closed his notebook. Evelyn Mary Forrester, I am arresting you on suspicion of manslaughter. You will be taken to Much Benham for further questioning. Robert Haydock stood. I'm coming with her. Craddock hesitated, then nodded. You may travel in the second car. As the constables moved forward, Miss Marple spoke again. One moment, Dermot. May I say something? Craddock inclined his head. Miss Marple looked directly at Evelyn. My dear, you are very young. Anger is a fire that burns hottest in the young. Mr. Hawthorne was rigid, proud, and quite often unkind, but he believed he was safeguarding standards. You believed you were fighting for your happiness. Between those two immovable beliefs, a man died. Remember that for the rest of your life and let it teach you gentleness. Evelyn's lips trembled. I will remember. Every day. Clarence Fowler rose stiffly. May I shake her hand, Inspector? For the children's sake? Craddock gave permission. Fowler took Evelyn's hand in both of his. You will always have a friend in St. Mary Mead, my dear. When this is over. The room watched in silence as Evelyn was led away. Robert Haydock followed, his face set like granite. When the door closed, Miss Hartnell gave a loud, indignant sniff. Well, I always said modern girls read too much Freud. Mrs. Dane Calthrop gave her a quelling look. And I always say we should read a little more Charity, Amy. Miss Marple stood. If you will forgive me, I think I should like to go home now. It has been a tiring afternoon. Craddock offered his arm. Together, they walked down the vicarage path. The September light was beginning to fade. Rooks wheeled above the elms. Will she hang, Dermot? No, Aunt Jane. Manslaughter, heat of the moment, no intent. With a good barrister and a sympathetic judge, probably a short sentence, perhaps even probation. Youth and remorse count for a great deal. And Mr. Fowler? Obstructing the police. A fine, I should think. He is 63 and has lost everything already. Miss Marple sighed. Everything and nothing. He has kept his self-respect. That is not nothing. They reached her gate. She paused. Thank you for indulging an old woman's fancy this afternoon. Craddock smiled. You knew from the first it was the knot, didn't you? I suspected. Knots are like handwriting, Dermot. They betray us when we least expect it. He bent and kissed her cheek. I'll telephone when there is news. Miss Marple watched the car disappear round the corner, then went indoors. Cherry met her with the kettle already singing. Shall I make a nice cup of tea, miss? Yes, Cherry, and open the tin with the petticoat tails. I think we have earned them. She sat by the fire and for the first time in 10 days allowed herself to feel tired. Outside, St. Mary Mead drew its curtains against the dusk, quietly closing ranks around its latest small tragedy. Tomorrow there would be fresh gossip, fresh scandal, fresh forgiveness. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and the Return of Peace. A fortnight later, on a morning so still that the smoke from every cottage chimney rose straight as a ruler, Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table contemplating a boiled egg and the front page of the Times. The egg was perfectly cooked, 4 minutes exactly. The toast was thin and buttery, and the Times contained nothing more disturbing than a debate about whether the new queen would keep her father's horses in training. Cherry came in with the second post. Letter for you, miss, London postmark. And Mrs. Dane Calthrop telephoned to ask if you'd take a cup of coffee with her at 11. She says there's something she particularly wants to tell you. Miss Marple slit the envelope with the butter knife. Inside was a single sheet of official stationery. Dear Miss Marple, I thought you would wish to know that Miss Forrester appeared before Mr. Justice Wainwright yesterday. The plea of manslaughter was accepted. Sentence: 2 years imprisonment, suspended for 2 years in view of her youth, her previous good character, and the strong provocation offered. She is free to resume her life, though naturally not at St. Mary Mead. Captain Haydock has obtained a teaching post for her at a preparatory school in Kenya. They sail next month and will be married in Mombasa before term begins. Mr. Fowler has been fined $25 for wasting police time and has retired on a small pension. He spends his days in the public library helping children with their nature tables. Thank you once again for your invaluable assistance. Yours ever, Dermot Craddock, in Spidst. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her pocket. Well, Cherry, she said, that is as happy an ending as one can expect in these cases. Cherry, who had been listening at the door in the approved manner, ventured an opinion. Fancy letting her off altogether. In my day, she'd have gone to prison for years. In your day, Cherry, people were hanged for stealing a sheep. The world grows kinder, slowly. At 11 o'clock precisely, Miss Marple walked the short distance to the vicarage. Mrs. Dane Calthrop met her at the door with an air of suppressed excitement. Come in, come in. I have the most extraordinary thing to show you. She led the way to the drawing room where on the table lay a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. It arrived this morning, from Kenya of all places, no letter, only this. Inside the parcel was a length of new hemp rope, neatly coiled and tied with an absolutely perfect double carrick bend, this time right-handed. Mrs. Dane Calthrop stared at it in bewilderment. Whoever would send such a thing? Miss Marple smiled, the small secret smile of one who has just seen a difficult pattern come out exactly right. A young woman who has learned her lesson, she said softly. She is telling us that she remembers the knot and why it matters, and that she will tie the rest of her life more carefully. Mrs. Dane Calthrop shook her head. You do wrap things up neatly, Jane. Not I, my dear. Life does that if we give it time. They drank their coffee and spoke of the harvest festival arrangements, the price of coal, and whether Mrs. Price Ridley's new hat was really purple or merely an unfortunate shade of heliotrope. When Miss Marple rose to leave, the rope lay between them like a silent promise. Outside, the village lay bathed in pale October sunshine. Children spilled out of the school for morning break, their voices rising clear and carefree. Clarence Fowler could be seen through the library window, showing a small boy how to identify an oak leaf. At the quarry gate, a new notice had appeared. Danger, keep out. Council workmen were erecting a neat post and rail fence. Miss Marple paused at her own gate and looked back toward the hill. The chalk scar gleamed as innocently as ever, but the path was closed now, and the iron ring would rust away in peace. She went indoors and sat down in her favorite chair by the fire. Cherry brought the tea tray. Shall I pour, miss? Thank you, Cherry. And would you open the new tin of shortbread? We deserve a little celebration. Cherry did as she was bid, then lingered. Funny to think it all started with a bit of rope. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Everything starts with something small, Cherry. A harsh word, a moment of anger, a knot tied the wrong way round. The trick is to notice before it is too late. Cherry considered. This then asked the question that had been hovering all morning. Was she very wicked, miss? The teacher, I mean. Miss Marple set her cup down with care. She was very young, very much in love, and very much afraid. That is a dangerous combination, but not a wicked one. I have known worse. She picked up her knitting. Today a comfortable pair of bed socks in a gentle shade of lilac, and the needles began their quiet conversation. Outside, the church clock struck 12. Somewhere a blackbird practiced its spring song, though it was only October. The village turned another page, and the story of the schoolmaster's fall slipped quietly into the great unwritten history of St. Mary Mead, where scandals are forgiven, fences are mended, and nothing truly dreadful ever happens.